Hey guys, it's good to see you again. So at last we've come to the final video of the metabolism videos and also the last video in this lecture series. So today we're going to talk about PE metabolism and break that down into SE and NE metabolism. So these two functions are perception functions just like SI and NI, which we discussed last time, and thus they are also spatial temporal in nature, which means that they handle volumetric data. That's data that's in our 360 degrees field of view, but also data that exists in any sort of mapping that can be mapped in a kind of latent space with proximity and distance between the data. But of course, the more latent space manifestations of these functions are a little bit more complicated to explain. So just like last time, we're going to start by taking a more physical or topographical look at how they work. And then from there, we're going to extrapolate into the abstract realm. So last time we said that this secondary world is PI, right? It's a representational map extracted from this first world, where that first world is reality itself. And that would be PE. And so we actually talked a little bit about PE by implication in the last video, because you can't even get this map going without at least first having PE take in that first world initially. So it's implied in PI already that there's a PE metabolic process at work. And you're going to see this dependency much more clearly as we go through this video. So if you've ever had one of these iPhones before, or just seen one of these iPhones that has the LiDAR scanner on them, you'll know that you have this ability where you can scan a room. And what happens is essentially you look at a region and then it scans the region and then it creates a mesh. And then as you turn around, it scans this new mesh. And as you turn around, it scans the other part of the mesh. But as you do this, it retains the meshes that you already scanned, even though you're not looking at those areas anymore. So this mesh that you're not looking at anymore is PI, as we discussed in the last video. And you do this until you've scanned the entire room. And then you go into the other room and into the other room until you have something that looks like this, a kind of map of the entire environment that you're in. Now remember, environment is not necessarily just topographical. It can also be abstract. It can also be conceptual. Like, for example, all the themes or ideas within a certain body of literature. Or you map out every element of a theory. You explore the different rooms of a theory, the sub-theory components and so forth. Whether it's CT, for example, or physics or what have you, exploration works the same way no matter what domain you're examining. So you map out every aspect of a system. You're thorough in checking every corner of the rooms until you have the entire thing mapped out. And that's your PI map, right? So that's what we discussed last time. But this time, what I want to focus more on is the PE scanner, not so much the mesh, but the scanner itself, because it really is important. And I want to illustrate that for you with this video game here. So what you see here on screen is a video game where you're basically unable to see except by means of this LiDAR scanner. And as you navigate your space, you direct your LiDAR scanner somewhere and you click scan, and it reveals to you the environment that you have before you there. Now, I like this game because, in a way, it's kind of a slowed down version of how our own perception works. First, to start with, we don't know what the outside world looks like. It's not until we direct our gaze somewhere, specifically the fovea, that we start to get high resolution information about that specific thing. So if you look at this video, you have to click a button in order to activate and map out a region. So that is a proactive process, right? So perception is proactive in the sense that you're saying, give me information. You're asking the outer world for information and you're essentially grabbing it from the outer world. And this is why PE is also the scout function. It's the explorer function. It's the information gathering function. Now, as you're doing this, you start to retain that information into a map. In this case, it's a point cloud map, but it's the same idea as the mesh we just looked at earlier. What's relevant is that their information is retained in a kind of relational coordinate space. That's what PI is. So as you see here, you walk around the space, continuing to scan, and eventually you map out the whole space because you've scanned every corner more or less. And so now you kind of know what's going on and where you are, right? Except not really, because the scans that you just did are only as good as the time frame in which they were taken. So one of the creepy things about this game is that if there are enemies approaching you, you can't actually see them approaching you unless you rescan the environment. And then suddenly you realize, oh, there's somebody there. I didn't see them. I didn't know they were there. And it's this kind of horror experience where you see these footsteps or these figures approaching you, and every time you scan them, they're closer and closer to your space. That's precisely how perception works. You scan it and it goes into PI, but the PI is not updated. And so you have to rescan and rescan in order to update your perception of the world. And this is happening at the millisecond level within us. PE is constantly taking in the environment afresh. It has what I call a refresh factor. So thanks to PE, we see all this new information all the time. And this is why PE is called both the explorer function, but also real time, because it gives us real-time reality. Whereas PI is called time because it actually stores temporal sequences from the past. It stores prior information. But the here and now is given to us only by PE every time it rescans. Now, having said all this, we are finally in a position where we can formally define what the PE function is in a kind of algorithmic language. Now, I actually use programming pseudocode to describe what these operations do in Model 2, but we're not going to use the pseudocode here today. However, we are going to still try to explain in more natural language sense what the operations are which make up the algorithm of PE. So there are three major steps involved in the operations, the mathematical operations of PE. The first step, number one, is scan for new objects. That is, objects that are not currently in working memory. So you scan an area, and if it's not in short-term memory, then that means it's novel. The definition of new objects is that they're not the same as the old objects. So scan for new objects implies checking against this mesh, let's say, to see if there's gaps in the mesh or where are the gaps. So that would be the equivalent of the black area here in this field, for example. These gaps are the unknown novel regions. So scan for new objects is essentially asking you to look for in the black space, scan the black space for new objects, because that's where we don't have the mapping yet. That's where we need to map. Now, number two, if new objects are found, then scan the surrounding area. So what this means, practically speaking, is if you've struck gold, then PE is instructed to continue to focus its gaze and its attention in that general region. If you're an explorer, if you're a miner and you struck gold, well, now you want to look for more gold, because if there are goodies here, well, there's probably more goodies around. Or for example, if you're watching Netflix and you watch the pilot episode and it's very interesting, it catches your attention, then you probably want to watch the second and third and fourth episode. We are directed to continue exploring somewhere that we've found novelty in the first place. And the third operation is, if new objects are not found in this area, then look elsewhere. So that could be either you've exhausted the new objects in this area, or maybe there weren't new objects here in the first place. If there's nothing new here, then the algorithm says, move your gaze and attention elsewhere. So scan for new objects by comparing them to old ones. If you find new objects, scan more in that general direction. And if you can't find any new objects, move your gaze elsewhere. Those are the three fundamental operations of PE as an information gathering process. And these three simple rules explain every other emergent behavior from PE. And here, let me explain how. So number one explains high openness, interest in new topics or ideas. And that could be as abstract as you could possibly imagine. Any type of topic you can think of, PE will be interested in it. And that doesn't mean that they'll stick to it or become an expert or a senior in it, but they'll at least want to dabble in it. They'll at least be curious about it. And this applies both to SE and NE. You will find SE or NE users in practically every domain of life at some level, at some degree, because they'll want to at least glance at it. They'll want to at least canvass it, survey it, scout it, spend a few months on it, maybe do an internship in it. Like maybe it ends up not being their niche. Nevertheless, they'll experiment in anything from politics to theology to literature, you name it. PE is a very flexible, general process that likes to inquire into every domain. So it's not domain limited. It's not domain restricted. Now, there does end up being a statistical fall off where the PE users are more represented in some domains and not in others. And that's because, you can dabble in everything, but ultimately more PE elites are going to continue to find more interest and intrigue in certain domains than others. And that will tend to be domains that have a continually dynamic flux of information. And so just to show you some of the possible ways that it can manifest, especially as you pair PE with other psychic processes in a complementary direction, then you can end up with a diagram that looks something like this. Now, again, this is not an exhaustive list of all the things that it can do, but I'm just showing you here some of the ways that PE can manifest when it's paired with other processes. So for example, here you see that if PE, the cognitive aspect, is combined with the motor system, it leads to a thirst for travel and movement. So if you want to go hiking, for example, or go somewhere, that would be an example of an activity PE would be interested in. But it also doesn't necessarily have to lead to physical travel, because over here you have the openness to new ideas, which you can do at home, and is actually a combination of PE with the analytical centers of our brain. Those parts of us that are hyper intellectual and want to make sense of things at an intellectual level, PE gives a huge thirst and boost of inquiry that can actually lead to binge reading articles, going down rabbit holes, Wikipedia for hours, for days, for weeks. That's the kind of result that you can get when your thirst for new objects is directed by the analytical centers. But then, quite differently, if you combine PE with, let's say, the power instinct, that part of us that wants to dominate or win, when you combine that with PE novelty seeking, then you get something like competitive play. Football, soccer, basketball, whatever sport, you name it. Because it's a combination of wanting to have that refresh factor activated, because every second of a game is dynamic. Things are moving. Everything is very real time. Combine that with the competitive instinct and you get very competitive sports players. So if you look at our statistics, PE dominates when it comes to sports and generally most dynamic situations. Because actually dynamic situations are in general a key part of what PE loves. If the environment is changing, then essentially the entire optic feed is wiped clean and refreshed by itself. So it has to rescan everything. So this leads to maximal novel data intake every time the whole optic feed is refreshed, which actually can happen whether they are moving through a soccer field or whether they are sitting at home playing video games. So here's another example. Competitive video games or esports is another domain dominated by PE leads. Because if you think about it, it's absolutely dynamic play. It's a competitive play where there's a constant real-time refresh of the information. So for example, League of Legends, Call of Duty, Smash Bros. Melee, you name it, all these video games are mainly dominated by PE leads who really enjoy the play. And so this is one of the obvious ways in which CT differs from, let's say, the Myers-Briggs system, in a sense that staying alone at home playing video games this way is technically still extroverting, because you are still dynamically interacting with objects, taking them in, responding to them. Your mind is going on fire, actually. So cognitively, you're definitely extroverting. But according to the Myers-Briggs system and many Jungian offshoots, many of these would say that staying home playing video games is an introverted activity, which is completely wrong, because you're not cognitively introverting, you're actually extroverting. You're interacting with the environment, which is the fundamental definition of extroversion. But they're using socialization level as their metric. So in the essential sense of its cognition, PE is extroverted when it's interacting with elements in a way that is dynamic, real-time, and fast-paced. Versus introversion is more about pausing to reflect, pausing the real-time to process. That is the fundamental difference between extroversion and introversion. So that's one misunderstanding about PE. Now, another interesting topic is actually reading. Oftentimes people will say that somebody sitting at home reading a book is the definition of being introverted. That's not necessarily true. It could go both ways. And let me explain how it could go in the extroverted sense. So let's say that you're watching The Lord of the Rings in a theater or on TV, right? That is, like we just mentioned, cognitively extroverted, right? You're taking in this real-time information that's coming at you rapidly through the entertainment medium. But now let's see, if you're reading that same book, the same Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Rings in paperback form, your mind is still doing roughly the same thing as you're reading the pages. You are taking in new objects and you're creating a scene essentially similar to the one you saw in the movie. You're not necessarily passively reflecting as you're reading. There's a certain kind of reading, specifically the class of novels, that are essentially movies. They're essentially dramas. They're essentially theaters. The medium, again, has changed, but the content, the cognitive content, is the same. So novels are essentially TV shows. If you binge read Song of Ice and Fire, it's the same as binge reading the show, cognitively speaking. And that's because what you're doing is you're absorbing objects, you're absorbing information. You're not necessarily sitting there and processing, reflecting, introspecting on those contents. You might. So it depends on how you do it, and there will be some admixture. So reading can cause a lot of introverting if it's the kind of thing that invokes introspection, but not all reading invokes introspection. That's the key difference. So with that said, these three activities, playing video games at home, participating in competitive sports, or reading a novel, are all different forms of PE activation. Now, while we're on the topic of misunderstandings of PE, there's one more misunderstanding I want to focus on, and that relates to PE and drive. So as I just mentioned, PE can lead to very competitive athletes, right? And it can lead to a kind of discipline within these athletes. In order to become a champion, whether it's in basketball, football, or MMA fighting, you have to grind through a lot. You have to put in hours and hours every day. And that actually goes against the stereotypical view that PE elites are these kind of lazy, aloof people that can't really stick to anything, can't stick to routines or schedules. That's only partly true, and I'll tell you how. It depends on whether or not there's a continual source of stimulation involved. So if the game is interesting enough, not just today, but tomorrow, next week, maybe even next year, then you can be a committed PE lead that grinds through day after day because the game is still continually dynamic and interesting to you. And that engagement can even last years or decades. And so PE leads can be very focused and attentive people if the thing that they're on is something that is really engaging to them. But this discipline is domain specific, and it's usually limited to the area in which they are interested in. But now outside of the game, this will typically not cross over as an overarching feature of their personality. So in other domains of life, they will lack structure in some ways. All right, having said all of that, we are now ready to talk about the two different forms of PE, and that would be SE versus NE. So we have P here at the top, which is real time, and then below that we have the two different forms of real time, one being SE as actuality and the other being NE as possibility. Both of these happen in real time in the present moment. So there are real-time actualities and there are real-time possibilities. We'll get into these terms more in just a moment here, but first let's talk about what actually is different metabolically between these two processes. So going back to these three fundamental aspects of PE that make up the algorithm, so to speak, the first part of it, scan for new objects, that much remains the same between both SE and NE. But in the next part here where it says, if more objects are found, scan more in that same region, that means something differently to both of these functions. And that's because scan for more as an operator is metabolized differently between S and N. So for S, scan for more means obtaining more literal data. And for N, scan for more means obtaining more associative data. So I want to talk about this idea of sensory. You'll notice that I don't ever say sensory to describe S, right? I say literality is S. And the reason for that is because the word sensory, in my opinion, fits PE in general more than any other process. Because if you think about it, so information comes in. First of all, information gathering is PE. Where is it gathered from? Well, initially, it's the raw inputs come from the optic feed, the auditory feed. It's multimodal. It can come from any of the input sources of the body. And from that is extracted objects that become the objects of consciousness, because everything the mind does is done through a kind of common denominator of symbols. So humans think in terms of symbolic representations, and every object immediately becomes a symbol when it enters consciousness. And a symbol can be a spoken word that you hear, or a written word which you see, or an image which you perceive, but then after perceiving it becomes, again, the concept. Like if you see an apple, you see the apple, but then it becomes concept of apple in your mind. Just as you can hear apple and the concept of apple enters in your mind. Whichever route it still enters as a concept that is in the mind. And so in this way, PE in general has multimodal sensory perception. But that's very different from what we mean by literality, which is an attitude of information treatment. So NE as an input device, so to speak, is more sensory than even SI. But again, we have to be careful with our terminology here. I'm not saying that NE is an S process. I'm saying that NE scans for inputs, just like SE scans for inputs. And that does have its consequences because, for example, you will notice that there are many NE artists, musicians, composers, just as there are many SE artists, musicians, and composers. Why is that? Because NE has a strong affinity, just as SE does, for the experiential sense of exploring the world. So NE actually does have somewhat of a nice relationship to the external world in that sense, but it stops around here. And then is when you see the differences between actuality or possibility, because that's when the processing occurs at this level here at the second stage. So as we mentioned before in this Venn diagram here, the S process or literality likes to focus on what is distinct about things, not so much what is similar between them. And so when SE is scanning for more literal data, it is looking for more what we might call distinctive features, features that set things aside as particulars, because that's what literal data is. So scanning for more data equals looking for more distinctive features. So if we're looking at, let's say, an apple here, it's not just a generic apple, because that has no distinctive features. We're looking for what's distinct about it. So it's specifically, let's say, a green apple. It's a Granny Smith apple. It's glossy. It has little spots on it. All these little particulars make it a distinctive object. SE is more attentive in this sense to what makes the object particular and unique. And the way that this is achieved metabolically is through an intensity of attention. Because the more closely you look at something, let's say this apple, the more features stand out at you. But you have to kind of scan with more intensity in a certain location in order to extract distinctive features from it. This is just how it has to happen metabolically. So to bring this point home, going back to this point cloud LiDAR scanner game that we discussed, if you wanted to get more distinctive features about a certain area, you have to click scan more and more times to scan to fill in more of the data, to have less of the empty black spots. That is how you can achieve what you're looking for, if what you're looking for is more distinctive features. So the search for more distinctive features implies, or actually necessitates, intensity of focus in a localized area. Hence you see the laser eyes of SE. Hence you see the less scattering and toggling and the more intense focus. Greater literal data extraction, greater detail extraction requires greater focal narrowing. So SE acts like a laser or a high-definition scanner that wants to get a highly sharp view of the environment and to generate the most realistic picture possible of the actual object in front of you, which is why SE is called actuality, because out of all the functions, SE is the most forthcoming and forthright in giving you the actual literal shape of the objects in front of you. Now, there are more reasons for why this word has been chosen for SE. So, for example, in English, the word actual retains the meaning of something being real or existing, which, as we just mentioned, correlates to how SE gives you the world in the most literal representation possible, in the most realistic representation possible. And also, the word actualize came to mean to make something real, right? To make something happen, which also describes the way that SE, especially with, for example, with competitive play, as we described, likes to bring things into action. It likes to make the real world move. However, in other Romance languages, such as Spanish, which I'm fluent in, actual means something like current or modern. And actualizar, which is to say actualize, actualizar actually means to update. So, for example, if your phone gets a new update, it'll say, ¿Quieres actualizar tu teléfono? Which is to say you want to update your phone. So to actualize is to make it current. But as we just discussed, PE is the real-time function and SE is a real-time function. So it actually does both. It brings to you the real existing reality, but it also makes things current. It also updates things towards that more realistic reality that you're in. So both meanings are preserved if from different languages. So to summarize and to put them all together, it's either the observation of things that are real and in the present, or it's making things real and making things in the present. And it's in this combined sense that I'm using the word actuality, not strictly in the English version, but in all the Romance languages put together. Because here we see the core essential elements of SE all expressed. And this makes sense when you consider that a different way to describe SE would be as real-time, that's PE, literality. So real-time literality is giving you the literal reality in real time. Now, just as with all the 8 functions, each one tends to look at information through a different philosophical viewpoint, right? A kind of ontological bias. And with SE, as you might have guessed, this inclines it towards the philosophy of realism. Now, for those philosophers in the room, I don't mean realism in the mind-body problem sense, but in the other sense here on screen, where SE typically concerns itself with this world as opposed to other worlds or hypothetical worlds. It's also the attitude or practice of accepting a situation as it is and being prepared to deal with it accordingly. So I summarize this oftentimes by saying that SE has this it is what it is philosophy of things, not trying to fudge it, not trying to alter it or see it differently than what it is. It wants to have a realistic view of the world, not a hypothetical or fantastical view of the world. Now, the term used for NE is possibility. So here again, as we said, scan for new objects is shared between the two functions. But in the second step, when we say if new objects are found, scan for more, the scan for more aspect of this operation is done associatively rather than literally. So you'll notice one thing, and that is that any kind of plays two different roles. At the initial level, it scans for new objects, and so it has an acceptance of information from the world that includes concrete information. It accepts it, it likes it, it wants it. But when it wants to scan for more objects, it associates and goes away. It leapfrogs. It tries to continue to explore in an associative domain, and it kind of stops its literal exploration right around here. Versus SE, it, like NE, takes in the information of the world, so it has concrete data input like here, but then it kind of doubles down on that. And so what it does is it looks deeper and more keener into information for greater distinctive features. And so relative to NE, SE will seem like more of a sensory process, and that would be, fair to say at some level, because it continues to look sharper, but it doesn't mean that NE doesn't also do some of that as well. It just kind of switches roles halfway through. So one doubles down on distinctive feature input. The other one, NE, has a more vague distinctive feature distinction, and then leaps to associative feature distinction after that. So that's kind of the metabolic difference here. Now, for the sake of this overview, I want to go over two different ways that this associative exploration happens with NE. The first one is similarity. So this reminds me of X. And the second one is recombination. So what if you took X and Y and Z, etc.? So beginning with similarity here, let's say the PE scanner observes this individual here. You're probably familiar with this individual. So your PI function, whether you have NI or SI, should be able to output at least a rudimentary answer, something like, that's Benedict Cumberbatch. However, since I've just provided you a new image, maybe you haven't seen this specific image of him, then that gives PE the opportunity to explore. So for SE, the exploration would go deeper into the distinctive features. For instance, oh, that's a sharp bow tie, or his hairline is receding even more now, or he looks younger here, or that background looks photoshopped, which it is, by the way. SE leads are more likely to notice that or to notice quicker. So those are distinctive features. But now the kind of things that NE might notice are associative. So for example, he looks like an alien, or he looks like a vampire, or he looks like a praying mantis. This cognitive activity of looking for things that intersect with whatever's in our current frame of vision is what we would call real-time association. So that would be real-time, PE, and association, N. So NE is real-time association. So just as SE will add new distinctive features on an object, so it's tagged along to it here, NE will add more associative features to an object, so it adds more things that it's like or things that it looks like. Now, NE users can notice that he has a receding hairline too, yes. SE users can notice and think to themselves, he looks a bit like a vampire. I'm not saying that any particular thought or idea absolutely cannot be generated by the other process. So this is a statistical reality. So if I were to take the Vultological NE leads and give them 100 such examples, statistically, most of the time, NE users will notice the associative connections, and most of the time, SE leads will be more inclined to notice the distinctive features. Now, one thing you might have noticed about these associations is that they are necessarily shallow. And I don't mean that in a negative way. By shallow, I mean that there doesn't necessarily have to be deeper and deeper layers to the idea. So for example, there doesn't have to be any kind of precedent for linking Benedict Cumberbatch with praying mantises. You could have come up with it on the spot, and it could be your original idea without anybody else having said it before. So that's what I mean by shallow, lacking previous connection. It's not like a long-standing archetypal connection in the sense of NI. Neither is it a long connection to different historical or chronological information the way it is with SI. It's a simple, newly generated instance. And therein is actually the beauty of it, because that means NE is inclined in some ways to make connections that haven't been made before, but without needing to be restrained by the past. Now, the association type that we just looked at is similarity. But another kind of association NE can make is one of recombination. And that's taking two or more different ideas and merging them together. So for example, let's say an NE user says, Benedict Cumberbatch would be great as a reptilian overlord in an Illuminati film. And here I have for you an AI-generated poster that could fit the theme. So that's taking several ideas, reptilians, Benedict Cumberbatch, Illuminati, pyramids, and combining them in such a way that they produce a new possibility. The possibility, in this case, of an alternate reality in which this is true, this is real. And so it kind of creates a chimera by combining these different points together. Now, metabolically speaking, these two forms of association are really the same thing. The only difference is the degrees of connectivity applied to the situation. The core operator here is make new connections. And by making new connections, you're essentially adding new or novel objects, because you make a new object when you do this. You generate a novel arrangement, and that is a kind of exploration. And to take this further, perhaps to the extreme, these new arrangements of linking together different points are theoretically infinite, which means that in theory, again, just in theory, NE could connect any point with any other point within its latent space. Any other piece of data could be linked to any other piece of data. Now, in practice, the combination options are pruned down a little bit with the help of JI and PI and JE, which makes some connections unviable. For example, if it's too unrealistic, JE might say that breaks causality, PI might say that breaks continuity, JI might say that's inaccurate. So some of these will just fall by the wayside. But if you just had undiluted pure NE by itself, it would have no trouble associating any point with any other point in this hub space, in this latent space. And so if left to itself, NE would allow the existence of, and it would validate every possible combination of objects, which is why the name of NE is possibility. In this case, possibility means the possibility of a reality in which X, Y, and Z come together, a reality in which ants can drive cars, a reality in which trees grow dollar bills, a reality in which birds have shovels for beaks, a reality in which everything is made of paint, a reality in which people have sausages for fingers, you name it. So NE validates, and I'll get to what validates means in a second here, but it validates all possible combinations, hence NE being called possibility. Now, having said all of that, I do need to define the word validates, and I'm going to first define it philosophically and then in a practical way, which is going to be very different. So philosophically, the philosophical position that most aligns with NE comes closest to this idea of modal realism. So modal realism is a philosophical theory by David Lewis, and he posits that all possible worlds are just as real as the actual world. So notice this is the very opposite idea to realism, which is for SE. So David Lewis says all possible worlds you can conceive of are just as real as this one. They're just inaccessible to us. So according to this view, somewhere out there in the multiverse, there is a version where this is happening, in which there are birds with shovel beaks, in which everything is made out of paint and so on. And I would say one of the most prominent modern ideas or modern applications of this idea is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which takes seriously the idea that every quantum state actually creates a branching universe when it makes a decision to, let's say, collapse the wave function into a certain form, which gives rise to a multiverse where every possible path that could have been taken is taken. So this idea is very compatible, let's say, with the ontological bias of NE. That's what validates means at the absolute philosophical level. However, at a practical level, at a down-to-earth level, with normal NE users that are not going at the philosophical extreme, NE validating possibilities takes a more normative meaning, where the main key difference is that NE will have less trouble buying into or believing in ideas or possibilities that other types would see as very unlikely. And this could be a very subtle thing to confirm, especially in adults, because adults have kind of learned and been informed by life, so the possibilities are naturally eliminated by just exposure. In this case, it's SI. The more SI fills up your brain and your mind, the less NE has room for play. But you can see this difference between NE and SE much more in children who still haven't developed this kind of adult mindset. So for example, all things being equal, NE lead children are more likely to believe in myths such as the Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, what have you, longer at least than SE lead children would. So maybe both would believe it at some point, but NE leads more likely to continue to hold it because you never know. A flying man flies around giving presents to everybody? Maybe. That maybe, what if? It could be. That suspension of disbelief, that benefit of doubt, is what NE gives more than other functions does. So in that case, it's optimistic. It's an optimistic process, and it gives suspension of disbelief. So that's what it means by validating possibilities. It has more openness to the possibility of things being other than what they seem. Now let's talk further about the different ways that NE manifests in a normative sense. So as we said, SE doubles down on reality as such and digs deeper into it, while NE kind of gets distracted, so to speak, and it wants to switch tracks. Now, by switching tracks, what I mean is that NE has a lust for something other than reality, because it wants to find an association that it can jump to, which is not in the tangible literal features that are directly in front of it. And so it wants to kind of jump to an alternate reality. It wants to jump, so to speak, through a portal gun to another dimension where the rules are different. That's interesting. That's new. That's exciting. Is when the rules are fudged, when the rules are different, and the possibilities are more than the ones you're seeing in front of you. And one tangible expression of this is real-time skits, as you guys know. So when NE is speaking and they kind of interject this skit into their discussion, they are kind of enacting the scenario in their head that is happening, which is kind of an alternate version of reality in which something else is happening. In a sense, validating that other track, the other timeline. Now, you might have noticed that there's a kind of connection here between NI translocality, which also seems to cut across dimensional planes, and what we might call NE's kind of dimension hopping. But in this case, dimension hopping mostly happens through quirky skits and associative tangents. And so that's the way that NE kind of travels in a translocal manner. But again, the objects don't have threads that are long-standing. It's just like an instant thing. It's fleeting. They're like bubbles in a froth. They pop and they pop and they pop and they go. These are kind of universes that are generated on the spot and they vanish just as quickly. So that's one way that you can see NE's thirst or acceptance of what isn't, but what could be, right? Possibility, another way of saying possibility is what isn't but what could be. Now, another way that we see this expression of NE for the possible is in its chosen topics of interest. So there's a lot of shared interest between NE and SE, specifically in art and creative domains, but there are different motifs which riff stronger on the NE side versus the SE side. And one of them is that NE will tend to favor topics that allow it to question reality, or in some way it upends a certain understanding. And now, to give a very practical example, we can take some science and physics YouTube channels to illustrate this point. For example, Vsauce, who's an NETI. There's also Up and Atom by an NEFI. And there's the Action Lab and many others. And what you'll see is that NE users get really giddy and very nerdy about things that seem to defy the laws of nature. They love these kind of law-breaking experiments that kind of allow for the what if to become real. So here's a few examples. Let's say a certain kind of chemistry experiment where there's an instant change of color. It kind of reminds you of the water to wine miracle in the New Testament. Another video is about the darkest black, a black so black that you can't even see any features. Or for example, this true invisibility cloak device, where you can actually go behind it and you can't be seen because it camouflages you completely. Or this cool one here is a laser blaster effect, kind of a light trick, created by combining a certain kind of laser with certain camera settings. So what these things do is they kind of bring closer to our reality these other possibilities that are also interesting. For example, yeah, wouldn't it be cool if there was actually laser blasters like in Star Trek? That would be awesome. Anything that brings that closer to reality is cool. All these alternate realities, all these possibilities, whatever brings them closer to this one is NE is all for that, because it actually wants that. That's kind of what it wants. It wants to bring in the possible novelty into the present as much as possible. And thirdly, NE can be seen in this tendency to have what I might call a more allocentric perspective. So allocentric means different from the center, or not having a fixed center point of reference, but instead treating multiple frames of reference as also valid. And this again comes from the desire to switch tracks. So for example, if you're looking from another dimension at the situation, or from this dimension here, you're in a sense validating different points of views such that there is not really one canonical point of view. That's one of the things that emerges from NE's cognition. What this leads to is a kind of a degree of relativity of viewpoints. So this person is saying this, this other person is saying that, and NE will say, I can see that too, and I can see that too. So all kinds of points of views can be seen in some sense, which also creates a different problem, which is what point of view should you prioritize most? And that becomes a challenging question for NE. Because if you think about it at a deeper level, it's almost like asking which world is the realist one, or are they all equally real? So you see how this ties back into modal realism, right? Modal realism leads to a kind of relativism, so to speak. That's philosophically speaking. But at the behavioral level, it leads to a kind of receptiveness to multiple viewpoints. However, this isn't without its own drawbacks, because this also means that there's less force or potency to any particular view. So NE struggles to stand too strongly behind any opinion or idea, because it could conjure up a dozen other different opinions and ideas that it can also stand behind just as well. You see the problem here. So the lack of SE's actuality and a lack of SE's realism, which gives SE this "it is what it is" aspect, leads NE to be less forceful by comparison to SE. So SE, on the opposite side here, SE, which is rooted in actuality and realism, it has a more linear perspective of what it is. This is what it is. And in that sense, it can channel its energy in one direction because there isn't that much ambiguity about reality itself. If therefore they tend to display, in a practical sense, much greater force and power. And this force and power is both physical but also mental. So for example, it speaks more directly about what it sees. This is what I see, but also this is what I want, but also this is what I believe. So it can be very much more gung-ho and assertive about its views. So that's another behavioral expression of NE versus SE in a tangible normative sense. Now, lastly, I want to talk about higher abstraction as it pertains to SE and NE. But by the way, I want to mention that up until now, most of what we've been discussing has been examples of concrete expression. Even the NE examples I gave are concrete because, for example, coming up with this Benedict Cumberbatch poster here is a concrete thing. It's a graphical object with tangible colors, tangible shapes. It's a tangible thing. So much of NE is actually tangible. When NE does a little quirky skit, it actually is a tangible skit. When NE draws a piece of art that combines together the different elements, it's still tangible, concrete expressions. Just as SE might do a choreography, or just as SE might do a piece of artwork, all of this is concrete expression. So NE has concrete expression as well, further proving the point that concretion is not necessarily the same thing as S versus N. Now, when NE or SE takes in highly abstracted objects, highly symbolic objects like metaphysics or theology or philosophy, SE and NE work in the same ways they do on that information, just as they work on the concrete information. So I want to give you an example. Let's say you have two college students, an SE lead and an NE lead, and then you have a teacher, a philosophy teacher. And the topic at hand is, let's say, Spinoza's panentheism. SE will want to explore the subject with greater sharpness and specificity. It will want to get a higher resolution understanding of the framework and what exactly is being talked about. So if the professor writes on the chalkboard that the universe is God, but God also transcends the universe and isn't bound by it, SE might raise his hand and say, wait, so God is the universe, but also not the universe? And then the professor might say, the universe is a mode of God's substance, an expression of it, but the substance itself is not limited just to what we see. And then the SE lead might respond back and say, so if everything we see is part of God, wouldn't that mean that my desk here and my chair here are literally God? Am I sitting on God right now? And then the teacher might reply, well, not exactly. The chair, the desk, they are expressions of God, but they're not the whole of God. So you could think of like a wave in the ocean, like a wave is part of the ocean, but the wave does not contain the whole ocean. And add a few more rounds of this, and then SC might be satisfied. However, notice that the inquiry was pointed. It was kind of trying to bring it down to specifics. Now, in the same classroom, let's say the NE lead might look at the chalkboard and think, oh, I get it. So it's kind of like that the universe is one slice of a pie, but the whole pie is God. Or all of existence is one room of a building, but the whole building is God, right? So there, again, we see any kind of drawing associations by analogies to other things. That's kind of the way that it would be inclined to process the idea more than the way that SE is processing it. Again, not that it wouldn't be able to do both, but in a statistical manner, you would see more of these kind of associative commentaries coming from NEs and more of these sort of sharply pointed inquiries coming from SE. Of course, this isn't the only way the conversation could go, and I'm not saying that these two students couldn't both ask the same questions, but I decided in this video at least to illustrate things in a more tangible way with more examples, just because I find that people like that and it's helpful. Okay, that wraps up the initial introduction into CT's information metabolism. There's, of course, much more that could be explored with interfunction dynamics and so forth, but that brings our current lecture series to a close. And thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next lecture series. Take care. Bye.